Hi, I'm Michael Figura. Welcome to this Adapt tutorial, creating your first plugin. In this tutorial, we're going to familiarize ourselves a bit with the Adapt framework, and we're going to get hands-on by writing a little code. We're going to create an example plugin that runs an import of data into the Adapt framework, and we'll use the Adapt framework to convert our data into a standard format that can later be consumed by other systems and equipment. There are several steps required to create our plugin, so let's walk through these before we begin. First, we're going to need to create a new .NET Core class library project using Visual Studio. Next, we'll install the Adapt framework using the package manager. After Adapt is installed, we can create our data model, which we'll discuss in just a moment. And after we create our model, we need to create some data mapper helpers to map from our data model to the Adapt data model. Finally, we'll implement Adapt's iPlugin interface and make use of the import method to perform our runtime work. Now, the tricky part about creating and testing a plugin is that it's in a class library and cannot run without a harness or a driver to control it. Luckily, the folks on the Adapt team have created a handy utility called the Adapt Visualizer for just this purpose. We'll install and use that visualizer to run our plugin and see our data converted like magic. We're almost ready to start coding, but before we do, let's briefly go over our custom data model. It's a hierarchical data model consisting of client data, and this client object has one or more farms, and those farms have one or more fields. Additionally, we have crop-related data, which consists of crops and crop assignments. Assignments data tells us what kind of crop, what field it's located in, and the growing season. We've discussed our objectives, the steps required to implement our plugin, and our data model. So let's get started coding. I've got Visual Studio 2017 open, but this example should work just fine on any version back to 2010 and even the new VS Code. So we'll create a new project, and let's choose class library .NET Standard, which is Microsoft's new naming convention for .NET Core. And I'm going to place my project at C:\projects\adapt. And let's call this new class library example plugin. And since there's only one project in the solution, let's go ahead and uncheck the create directory for solution. And click OK. Now we have an empty project, and we can go ahead and delete the class1.cs file. We won't be using that. And all we're left with is an empty class library project with the default Core SDK. We'll need to add the Adapt framework to our project, so let's open up the package manager and type Adapt. You'll more than likely get multiple results, so make sure the one you select is called Ag Gateway Adapt Framework. Check the example plugin and hit Install. And now we have that NuGet package added to our solution. And since I know we're going to need it, let's install one more NuGet package for JSON serialization. Let's install the Newtonsoft.json package. And there should be one or two results. Make sure the one you're going to select says version 11.0.2 or higher, and add that to example plugin. Now that those packages are installed, let's create some folders for our project structure. I'm going to build really quickly to make sure I have no errors. Everything looks good. So let's right-click our project and start adding some folders. Let's name this new folder Publisher Data Model. And underneath that, we can add one more folder and call it model. All right, now we're ready to start adding code. So let's add our first class. We'll just do a basic class here, and we'll call it data.cs. And this will be our top level parent object. Let's go ahead and get rid of model from our namespace. We don't need that. And let's go ahead and make this class public. Now, because I don't want a bunch of wet or duplicated code everywhere, I'm going to make an object called base object, from which a lot of our other objects are going to inherit from. So we'll give it a GUID of an ID, and we'll give it a name as well. We'll make that a string. Now let's create a second class called client data. Well, again, we'll get rid of the model, and we can get rid of some of these using statements that we won't be needing. We'll make this class public as well. And I'm going to change it to just client. We don't need the word data on there. I'm going to inherit from base object as well. And let's make a sub object that will exist through the client, and we'll call it farm, and then make it inherit from base object as well. So farm will by default have an ID and a name. And let's give a field in here as well and let it inherit from base object. Now let's create the relationship that says that farms have one or more fields. Now we've newed up fields, but we need to declare fields. Let's build, make sure we have no errors. And now let's do the same thing at the client level. We're going to make sure that the client has one or more farms. And we'll follow this exact same pattern. And let's build, and no errors. Now let's jump back over to data and start adding client data, or client information. So we'll make a list of clients. And then we'll need to declare clients. And built again, no errors. And now let's add a third class. And this one will be for crop data. We'll get rid of that model, Make this class public as well. Now before we populate our initializer, why don't we create some of the subclasses? We'll create crop, and it'll inherit from base object, giving it an ID and a name. And then we'll create crop assignment. But notice crop assignment doesn't inherit from base object. I want to show a little diversity here in this programming model. Crop assignment is going to be kind of unique. Instead of having an ID, it's going to have a crop ID. And instead of a name, it's going to have a field ID. And then I'll give it one more public property here. We'll give it a growing season. And we'll just use an integer to represent that. And we'll build. Still looks good. So let's let the relationship from crop data to crops exist here, as well as crop assignments. And now obviously I'll need to declare these variables. Now I've left the S off of the one above, which is going to make this not build. So let me remove this S really quickly, and we'll do a shift build here, make sure everything's good. But I want to follow that same pattern. So let's make them both S's, because lists should be pluralized. And our build looks good. Now it's time to add our data mapper code. Because our data model is proprietary, there's no free lunch here. We have to write a little bit of code to physically map from our data model to the adapt data model. So we'll start with a new folder called Data Mappers. We'll add our first class, and we'll call it, let's call it Client Farm Field Mapper .cs. Now we'll add our second class, and we'll call it Crop Mapper. And finally, we'll add our third class. We'll call it Data Mapper, and that's our top level object in the hierarchy. Let's start working on Data Mapper first. As you might guess, we need to add our Ag Gateway using statements. This allows us to get to the adapt data model. So we'll add the ADM, and then we'll add the common. And to make coding a little bit easier, I'll go ahead and add a reference to our publisher data model. Let's go ahead and make this public. And since we don't need anyone newing these things up in memory, let's go ahead and make all of our data mapper classes static. So we'll make our first method static as well, which is map data. A map data accepts a data object. And you'll see this pattern recurring throughout all of our data mappers. We're always going to pass in a catalog. The catalog is what allows us to map from our proprietary data model to ADAPT's data model. So let's make a unique ID method here where we can say we want to get the native ID. So we'll pass in our base object and then transform that base object's unique identifier into a unique ID that works for the ADAPT data model. So we'll start with a unique ID. We'll new one up. And then we'll say that that ID is equal to our ID. And then we'll give it an ID type of UUID. And a source. And I'm just going to make something up here. I'll just say HTTP publisher.example. And then the source type. And I'll use this enum here. And I'll just say URI. And finally, I'll return the ID. Okay, we've got a good build still. Now it's time to work on our client farm field mapper. Again, we're going to have our using statements that make use of the ADAPT framework. We'll start with ADM, and then we'll use logistics. Let's make this public and static. And let's make our first method map field. And we'll always use our publisher data model. We'll reference our field here. We'll call it my field. And then we'll pass in the catalog. Or actually, we'll pass in farm first. We'll call it adapt farm. We need the farm because farms have fields. And then at the end here, we'll pass in catalog. So we'll call this adapt field. We'll new it up. And then let's get rid of our error by returning the adapt field. So that's our lowest level. This is going to start with client at the top, then farm, then field. So we'll do the middle method here, map farm. We'll use our publisher data model again. And this time we'll use farm. Call it my farm. And this time we'll show the relationship between farm and grower. And then we'll pass in our catalog again. Now, just like we did below in field, we'll create a new farm. Let's get rid of our error. And finally, we can come back to the top here and do our top level client, which in our case is a grower. Client, in our case, is synonymous with the adapt term grower. You call it My Client. And since this is top level, there is no relationship object, just catalog. And we'll new up a new grower. Get rid of that error. Let's see if it builds. Looks good. Now let's go back to the bottom and we'll code our way up. Let's first start by assigning our adapt field ID by adding the output of our data mapper method that we wrote earlier, get native ID, and we'll pass in our field. Next, we'll set our adapt field description equal to myfield.name. Now we need to give this field a farm ID. And that's where that farm comes in handy that we passed in the method signature. And now we'll add it to the catalog. Now let's follow this exact same pattern, but for farms. So we'll add our data mapper method, get native ID, but instead of field, we'll pass in farm this time. So now let's set our description equal to myfarm.name. And we'll set our grower ID equal to adaptgrower.id. And then finally, like we did below, we're going to add this farm to the catalog. And now let's top this all off at our map grower top level method. And we'll do our get native ID again. Then we'll set our name. And we'll add our grower to the catalog. Now we need to write a series of for each statements, because growers have more than one farm and farms have more than one field. So we'll write our first one for farms. We need to loop through each of the client farms. So we'll say farm, adapt farm equals map farm, and here's where our actual mapper methods come in. We pass it the farm, the grower, and the catalog. And now we can write our second for each statement. And that's inside of the map farm method. where we map our fields. So we'll start with the field adapt field, and set it equal to our mapping field method below. We pass in the field, the farm, and the catalog. And let's build, and everything looks great. And now we're to the crop mapper. Again, we'll add our using statements for Ag Gateway Adapt. We'll use ADM. And we'll use logistics again. This one, because it's crop related, we're going to add products. And because I know we're going to query some of these objects, we're going to use link as well. So let's go ahead and make our class public and static. Then we'll make our first static method. Then we'll call it map crop. So we'll pass in a crop object and a catalog. So we'll start with our adapt crop. We'll new that up. And let's get rid of our error by returning that adapt crop. And now we can start setting that a crop's properties equal to mycrop.name. And then we'll use our getNativeID method. And then finally at the end here, we'll say crop catalog.crops.add, and we'll add our newly created adapt crop. And that should build fine, and it did. Now we've taken care of crop, but crop assignments have to happen, and we'll call those crop zones. We'll pass an assignment and catalog. Now let's start with an adapt field. And we're actually going to use some link here. We're going to query the crop assignment by field ID at first. We're going to say we want any of those. And then we're going to use a second ID for assignment.fieldID toString. And then we're going to create a crop zone. New that up. And then start setting its properties. I'm going to use a little string function here so I can concatenate two of these properties together pretty easily. A little string formatting. So our description's set. And now we need to set the field ID. And then just add that crop zone to the catalog. And now let's return our new adapt crop zone. Now that should build. It did. Now let's add a little bit of code we were missing from our data object in our publisher data model. We were missing some crop data. So we'll say public crop data. Declare this variable. And now we can implement our map data method. We'll say for each client in my data model.clients, we'll start with the grower. Then we'll move on to our farms. Let's pass in our crop data. We'll do crops first, then crop assignments. Crop assignments. And we use our crop mapper, map crop assignment method, pass in our assignment and our catalog. And let's build it. Looking good. We're almost done with our coding, but we have one more exercise left, and that is to create our new plugin.cs file. We'll start by adding our using statements. We'll start with ADM. And we'll also add our newtonsoft.json because we're going to do some serialization here. Do a little system I/O for some file-related work, and link for some query-related work. Let's make this class public. And now we're going to implement the I plugin interface. And if we hit Control period, .NET will implement most of it for us. So we'll start at the top here. And we'll say that name is equal to example plugin. Next, we'll do the version. And we'll just set it to 0.1. We'll set our owner to adapt, or no, let's do add gateway. Now, there are a series of methods here that we don't need to worry about. We can just leave them all not implemented exception. but we are going to add a new one. It's an iList application data model. And it's going to return the result of an import function. And we're going to pass it two things, a data path and the default properties. Now inside this method, we're going to create a list of application data model. And we're going to set that equal to models, and we're going to new up a list of application data model. And let's return models so we get rid of our error. And now let's create a string array of my data files, because we're going to go to a directory here and look for our JSON file. We'll create that JSON file in just a little bit. And we're going to look for anything with the myJSON extension. We'll use the search options, all directories. Now let's create an if statement. If any file exists, then we're going to new up an ADM application data model. And we'll set our catalog equal to a new catalog. We'll use a string formatter here again. And we'll say adapt data transformation of publisher data. We'll insert a date time now. And let's shorten that to a too short date string. And then let's include our data path. Now let's add to our model that ADM that we just created. And now we need to loop through the files in that directory. And for each of those files, we'll say string myJSON and read that file, getting the JSON from it. And we'll just say it's system.text.encoding.default. Now let's use our publisher data model again here. And we'll say my data is equal to, and here's where we use our JSON converter. We're going to deserialize that object. We're going from JSON to an object. And the object we're going to is publisher data model.data. And now we instantiate our data mappers. We're going to make use of the highest level data mapper, and say map data, and we'll pass it the JSON that we just got deserialized as my data, and we'll also pass it an ADM.catalog. And that built just fine. Now there's one more method in here we have to implement, otherwise it'll throw an error when we use the Adapt Visualizer. So we're going to use this is data card supported, and we're just going to say if there is a file there in our path and it ends with the extension my.json, we'll use the same search options. Then we're going to return true. Else, we're going to return false. And that'll keep a runtime error from occurring. And we'll build it, and looks good. Now I'm going to show you a little trick here. You can code JSON in Visual Studio, but you're going to need some GUIDs for our data. So go up to Tools and hit Create GUID, and we're going to hit Create GUID here. You can do New GUID and then copy that. That'll copy it to your clipboard, and you're going to need this. And I'll show you another little trick here. Let's close this out. Rather than coding in Visual Studio, Notepad++ has a really nice plugin. It's free. You can find it. It's called the JSON Viewer, and you can install it for free, download it for free, and install it. And this will allow you to type your JSON and also see a tree structure on the left-hand side. So you're going to want to pause your video here and code up this JSON as you see it. There's no way around this. We need an input file. We need some sort of data to go into this thing. Also, before we run it, you sometimes get some errors. Make sure you have all of the following DLLs. Now, we're going to switch to the visualizer here to actually run our plugin. You can look at the URL here at the top here. What you're going to do is go to this URL, click download, download that file, unzip it, and then once you have it unzipped, you'll be staring at this visualizer in Visual Studio. And we're just going to hit start. Now once it gets up and running, we wrote an import plugin, not an export, so you're going to hit the import button. And then make sure you browse to the correct directory where your DLL exists. I've got mine already located here to the debug. Then you hit load plugins and you'll see example plugin will load right here. And then make sure you get your JSON file directory correct here. You can browse to wherever you saved that JSON, then you hit import. It'll only take a moment. Import complete, and you should see the following file format where you have a tree structure, and all of the data in your JSON file has now been converted into the adapt format that you see before you here. So we'll start with our growers. We can see we have one unique ID, and that grower has two farms, a home farm and a west farm, and they have 3 fields. Each of those fields has an identifier, etc. Then we have crop zones. We have 3 east field, home quarter, and west field. And then we have crops, corn and wheat. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on writing your first Adapt plugin. I'm Michael Figura. Thanks for watching.